Shalom and welcome. This is Karen Hannah in Jerusalem for His Israel. And today we'll be taking a look at the 8th Hebrew month of CHESHVAN. In our series where we've been going through the cycle of the Hebrew months and in a series called Keep Climbing, which is part of the Being Holy, Being Whole series. And each month we've been looking at different characteristics or character traits and seeing where we might have maybe a weakness and that needs strengthening, or if we have a strength that needs even more strengthening. So just to help us grow and learn and just aim higher spiritually and just in our daily lives. So this is the 8th Hebrew month of CHESHVAN, which actually starts on the 30th of October, so we're getting a preview here. And the traits we're looking at this month are compassion and flexibility. Now the main focus will be on compassion. There's so much in that aspect of compassion, but also we'll see how it affects flexibility, that in an interesting way you need to have compassion in order to be flexible in your outlook and your attitude. So each month we have a verse, a scripture verse, and this month it's Exodus 22:26, and which says, when he or she cries out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. There's so much in that verse. And the greatness and goodness of God are made evident in that He hears. He says, when He cries out to me, I will hear. So we know He is a God who hears. But He hears even the unheard cry. So of those people whose cries usually are unheard by others, He will hear. And even the silent cry He hears. He hears the cries of our hearts, even if we can't put it into words. And when He hears, it says He responds in compassion, in rachamim. Hi Lisa and Cindy and Marcella, good to see you. He responds in rachamim, and it's interesting to note that whenever that word appears in the Bible, it's always the plural form, rachamim. And I think that just shows us how many levels there are in this attribute of compassion, the grace, the love, the feeling, the compassion. It's a wonderful word. Now, the fact that God hears is, of course, illustrated in the great occasion of the Exodus from Egypt, that He heard the cries, we told, of the Israelite slaves in Egypt, and this resulted in their deliverance. So He acts. When He hears a sincere cry, God will act. Also in Genesis 21, verse 17, even earlier in Genesis, we read how Hagar and Ishmael had been driven out into the wilderness, and they'd run out of water, and the boy Ishmael was crying as he was dying of thirst. And suddenly an angel messenger appeared and told Hagar, do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying. And then He revealed a well of water to her so they could drink, and their lives were saved. Now, in his commentary on this passage in Genesis, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs points out that hearing is the basis of both justice and compassion. So that hearing is very important, and it's the basis not only of compassion but also justice. How? We have an example when King Solomon, God asked King Solomon, what gift would you like to receive? You can say anything, and God wanted to give him a gift. And what did He say? In 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 19, He says, grant your servant a listening heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. So that's a beautiful concept there. He prayed for a listening heart. So the heart is the seat of love and of emotion and of compassion. And he wanted a heart that could hear the cries and the voices of his people. So he said, because he knew he needed that to govern his people properly. And hi, Josie. Thank you. And he just knew that's what he needed, and even that would help him establish justice, right, the knowledge between right and wrong. And Rabbi Sachs also quotes a Hasidic leader of the 1800s, a Rabbi Jacob Leiner, and he wrote, "Hearing has a greater power than sight, than seeing. Sight discloses the external aspects of things, but hearing reveals their inwardness." So that's a very powerful understanding, because and Audrey Ferrier is here. Hi, and Shirley from Texas. Thank you. Lovely that you could be here. So he's saying that hearing is actually a more powerful sense than seeing. And interestingly, I remember on my first visit to Israel, it was with a group of 5 women friends, and I remember our meeting with a woman in Jerusalem who was blind from birth. She'd actually been born in the States, but the Lord had called her to Israel, and she had a little keyboard, and she played beautifully, and she had a voice like an angel, and she used to sit on that stone bench outside Jaffa Gate and just play and sing the Psalms in Hebrew. She was studying Hebrew with a rabbi, and she just used to sing the Psalms in Hebrew. And she was blind, so she couldn't see, but people would gather around, and even the men. And I'd noticed the men would just have tears running down their faces. She was just singing. The song was ministering to their spirits and their hearts. And but what was interesting with her, Brenda was her name, and what was interesting was we spent some time with her, and she somehow understood. She picked up aspects of each one of us without us sharing any personal information, but she was so understanding of each one and being able to discern something. And it's true, it was like she was seeing past the external layers of personality that we all have, and it was almost like she had the gift of seeing straight into a person's heart and soul. She could just see straight into the inner person, and was able to discern so much more of the subtleties of the person in what she heard than what she could just see. Because often, if we have to get past the externals first, it takes a long time to really get to know somebody more inwardly. So that was to me, it was a proof of this fact that hearing, if your hearing is really attuned and you're listening to another person, then you learn a lot more. Now, you know what the central prayer is in Judaism is the Shema, which means Shema, listen or hear. And in Deuteronomy 27 verse 9, it says, in effect, be silent, Israel, and listen. Sometimes we have to quieten ourselves down in order to hear, to listen. And, we usually, in Israel or in Jewish circles, close our eyes when we say the Shema, because it's like a outward restricting of our sight, so we can really focus on listening, and in order to Shema, to hear more intently. And in the West, we have this saying like we gain insight into something. You have insight, or you say, "Oh, I see," when you understand. But in Hebrew, we say, "Ani shomea," I hear you, and it sort of also puts the focus on the hearing of the other person. Now, Rabbi Sachs also in his commentary pointed out an interesting fact that in Deuteronomy, there are the Shema is mentioned 92 times. Just that word Shema, 92 times. So I think God was trying to impress something here on the Israelites. And he also said that there's no word in Hebrew for obey. You must obey. There's no word in Hebrew for that, for obey. Because it tells us God is not a tyrant who over his people, who's just commanding, you must obey this and you must obey that. We know he's rather a loving father and a teacher of those who want to hear and respond to his will because they love him. So the people of God are just, you don't say you have to do this. It says no, just hear, listen intently and understand and internalize the word that you hear and respond to that word in our will and our thought, word and deed, if we're really hearing what he's saying. Because God doesn't want blind obedience, like fear-based obedience, but rather our voluntary, love-based partnership with him and cooperation with him. In love, we're called to imitate him, to reflect his light of truth and love and life and compassion into the world, just as our Master and Messiah, Yeshua, did. You remember when Yeshua came out of the waters of John's baptism, the voice, God spoke from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And what did he say? Listen to him. He was going to be speaking words of truth and bringing the word to life in what he said as well. Not doing away with the word, the Torah and the Hebrew scriptures, but bringing them into the everyday life of the people. I love the verse in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 4 to 7. It says, "But God, being rich in mercy and compassion, because of the great love with which he loved us." That tells us that this mercy and compassion stem from love, this incredible love that we can't even fathom how much he loves us, each one of his children. And Paul says, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Messiah, and raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Messiah Yeshua. So in Messiah we're seated with God in the heavenly places in our spirits, so that in the coming ages he, God, might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness, compassion towards us in Messiah. So there's a lot in that, but you can see how often it mentions kindness, compassion, the great love which he has for his children. And that's the basis of his word for us. Okay, now each month we've been looking at the character trait and finding the balance of it. So let's look at the compassion in balance. Now, a healthy compassion it's a healthy kind of kindness. It can also be expressed as chesed, loving kindness. That is the center point, the balance. But now you start going too far over to the one side and you get sentimentality. It's like a syrupy, sweet, over sentimental attitude towards a person or a thing. And this usually leads to an unwise kind of tolerance. In other words, it's good to have tolerance, to tolerate, have a healthy tolerance of things and people. But if you go too far, like an unhealthy tolerance, it's saying, oh, well, they don't really know, and never mind, and it's sort of almost not helping the person in whatever the situation is. And this unhealthy, unwise tolerance and sentimentality will inevitably lead to suffering. It doesn't help anyone concerned. So that's a sort of negative kind of compassion. Then you go to the other side of that, and you find, instead of this syrupy, sentimental compassion, you find a cold disinterest. It's like the person's not even interested in the other person or the situation or other people. And this leads to injustice, because then they can't make a fair judgment. They just become strict and rigid in their attitudes. And this will definitely lead into a kind of cruelty, because they don't have any feeling or compassion for whether it's a person or an animal or whatever. They don't have any feeling. I actually heard a quote once, and I don't remember who it was, but they said, a person without compassion is the ugliest thing they'd ever seen. Because you can pick up if someone has no compassion. There's just this coldness and a rigidity that's very unappealing. But so there we see where this flexibility comes in. If you have compassion, you're able to give a more fair and just decision or judgment in any situation. So I thought that was an interesting balance there of compassion. Now I'd like to share something that I came across. You know that on Yom Kippur we read the book of Jonah, the scroll of Jonah, and Jonah is, and we're all familiar with the story, so it's just interesting to make the application that it's an illustration of justice and compassion, which is what we're looking at. It's in her book called Return, a daily inspiration for the days of awe. Erica Brown highlights how the true struggle in the book of Jonah is the battle between justice and compassion. Now Jonah clearly is a picture of the person who's turned his back and is moving away from God and from God's command, and is running from the calling on his life. He was called to be a prophet, and he was given a command by God, and he's turned and running away. Now in the Hebrew word, in the Hebrew text, the word yored means to go down. And all through the text in Hebrew, you see Jonah's going down and going down and going down. The minute he turns from God, well, physically he goes from his home in the hills around Nazareth, and he goes down to the port of Jaffa on the coast of Israel. And then from there he goes onto the boat and goes straight down into the lowest recesses of the boat and falls into a deep sleep. And then we know what happens. A big storm, a raging storm arises, and the captain's getting so worried, and he's looking for Jonah, and he finally finds him, and he wakes him. He says, "How can you lie here sleeping so soundly? When we're in such dire straits here, and the ship's just being tossed around in the waves." And this sleep of Jonah's actually reflects the spiritual state of those who turn away and get far from God. And it's like you're going into this sleep, this state of sleep, that you're not even awake or aware or alert or hearing anymore or seeing what God's wanting to show you. And that's why we have all those shofar blasts through Elul and Rosh Hashanah. It's just to say, wake up, you sleeper. It's time to wake up again and turn back if you've gone off the track somehow. Well, anyway, as we know, Jonah's next descent from the ship is when he tells the captain and the sailors, "Throw me overboard," which in the end they do very reluctantly. But and then of course we know that what happens is the storm immediately subsides. And Erica Brown points out, she says, "The sailors then offered sacrifices to Jonah's God, fearing him in a way that Jonah, who was absorbed in his self-pity, all he could think about was himself, that Jonah did not." So they even honored Jonah's God, which he was not doing. And only when he was in the sea and sinking down to the lowest depths of the sea and realizing he's facing certain death, then Jonah cries out to God. Now, it was obviously a hard cry because he couldn't open his mouth very much in the seawater, but he cried out to God. And he says, will I never gaze again upon your holy temple? And God shows mercy and compassion. And we know Jonah's swallowed by a big fish, and that spits him up on the shore near Nineveh. And I thought that was really cute. I mean, God was just saying, this is where you're supposed to be. I've sent you to Nineveh. And Jonah finally understands with great reluctance that he must complete his mission and be the first prophet to prophesy outside of Israel. That was one of his hesitations, actually, because usually a prophet's always prophesied in Israel, but he didn't want to go outside of Israel to prophesy, and especially not to a nation who that historically had been enemies and would be enemies of Israel in the future. So anyway, now he knows he needs to go, and he goes into Nineveh and he makes the proclamations that in 40 days the city's going to be destroyed. But what happens? The king of Nineveh expresses a hope in the compassion of God, the God of Israel, the God of Jonah. And he says, he declared a city-wide fast and said in chapter 3, verse 9, he says, who knows but that God may turn and relent. So even he's having hope that God will have compassion and not destroy them. But Jonah, he's not budging, and he stays trapped in this black and white mindset of strict justice. He hopes that justice will prevail and these enemies of Israel will just be destroyed. And he sets up that little booth outside the city and watches and waits there to see if it's going to happen. And God causes this plant, it's a kikayon, I'm not sure what it is, but it must be a big leafy plant that grew up next to his booth and provided shade for Jonah, which was very welcome. It was obviously a very hot time. And for the first time, he actually expresses happiness. He was so happy about this lovely plant that was giving him shade. Why? Because he saw it as a sign of God's care for him, that, God was still with him and he was providing for him what he needed. But then suddenly what happens? It dies. And he's just so upset that he even says he'd rather die than he got so upset. But God's really wanting to teach him a vital lesson through all this. Because we see in chapter 4, near the end, well, it is the end, it's the last 2 verses. It says, and the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? So God's showing me, I thought it was really nice that he added the cattle, because our compassion should also extend to people and to animals and to living things. Jonah cried about the plant because that was doing him some good, but God's pointing out how much more should God not have compassion and mercy on these people in the city. And then Erica Brown finishes by saying, Jonah wanted pity, mercy, nurturing, and protection, all aspects of the love and care we receive from others, yet he could not extend that gift of mercy to others. So he was wanting that himself, but he wasn't prepared to extend that to other people. So God wanted to show Jonah that true authority it lies in balancing justice and compassion. They were enemies of Israel, but you have to have compassion and balance that justice. And I think he was also saying that the ideal prophet, or someone who speaks on behalf of the Lord, should have a deeper longing to care for and encourage people more than just criticizing or judging negatively. So the book interestingly ends with a question. That was the question. Shouldn't I, God, not pity Nineveh with all these people and cattle? And we're left to wonder, how does Jonah respond? Does he learn from God and repent or not. We don't know. But the question is left there to challenge us too. Do we sometimes doubt God's call on our lives and hesitate to do what we know we should? Do we judge and criticize others rather than extending care and compassion to them? Are we filled with self-pity sometimes when facing tough challenges? It's hard. It's easy to feel sorry for oneself when you're really going through something tough. But at the same time, you have to have that heart of compassion for others. And Jonah showed how if you don't have that compassion and we're just feeling sorry for ourselves all the time, then there's no room for repentance, for CHESHVAN, for turning back to God, and then being able to experience a proactive, constructive change. So there's a big lesson there. And as we press on our own spiritual calling and our climb and our journey, and in our attempt to learn more of God and imitate our loving Father more into the lives of others, to reflect His image into the world, we need to have a deep well of compassion in our hearts. We really need to just have a deeper well even than we might have already. Just say, Lord, give me your heart of compassion for your children and for all you've created. You know, in the Bible we know it consistently emphasizes the importance of being compassionate to the poor, to the widows and the orphans and others in need. And the sages of Israel actually consider that compassion for others is so vital that they say anyone who is not compassionate is certainly not a descendant of our father Abraham. Which is a serious thing to say, because to be a descendant of our father Abraham means that we're part of the people of God, which we are. But if for one who has no compassion, it's almost as if they've moved themselves out of the family of God. And because that is not God's heart, they're not reflecting God's heart. So actually, just to finish, Alan Marinas in his book Everyday Holiness describes true acts of compassionate kindness. And he says, don't worry about loving the poor. Your job is to feed and clothe them. Make some provision for them. And he says, if people you know are ailing or ill in any way, don't only think about them or pray for them, which is very important, but take your time, if possible, to go and visit them or send a little token, a tangible token of your care. And then he says, of course, offer your comfort to the bereaved or those in a house of mourning. And he points out that the burying of the dead is actually the greatest example of true compassion and chesed, because a corpse is unable to do anything for itself, but also cannot reciprocate the kindness shown. He says, if you do something something kind and good without expecting anything in return, that's the highest form of kindness. So let's finish. I'm just saying, let us really pray and trust and aim to be the person who cares, to be the person who makes an effort and loves without hesitation. Let us be the person to make others feel seen and heard. So there's nothing stronger, I came across this as well, which says there's nothing stronger than someone who continues to stay soft in a hard and uncaring world. And we know the world today seems to be getting more and more hard and uncaring. So let us be the people that reflect God's compassion and care and light and love into the world for His glory. Amen. And blessings to you from Jerusalem. Bye.